Morning, everyone. My name is Barney and I'm delighted to be co-organizing this Keystone Symposium together with my friends Bob Cedar and Gagandeep Kang. Welcome to this great city of Atlanta. And as you've heard, this is the 50th anniversary of Keystone Symposia. And in all those 50 years, this is the very first time that this meeting has been organized in the city of Atlanta. And that's not just because I spent 15 years in Atlanta. There are some other reasons I'll come to in a minute. But in any case, the title of this symposium is, what is it called? Vaccinology before, during, and after COVID-19. And it's deliberately designed to take a historic perspective on the field of vaccines as we've known it, and the changes that have happened during the pandemic and where we think this might be headed. So there is a major emphasis on the immunology of vaccines because after all, to us immunologists, this pandemic has represented the largest human immunology experiment in history. Why do I say that? Because there are some billion plus cases of confirmed infections, 13 billion doses of vaccines that have been given globally, and a seemingly endless succession of variants that continue to infect us. So the opportunity to analyze the immune response in great detail has been remarkable and unprecedented. The amount of human immunology knowledge, foundational knowledge that's accrued from this will continue to provide important new data for conceptual advances. But this meeting is not just about immunology. We deliberately designed the program to address some of the major societal issues that has come to the fore. And I'm talking about vaccine equity. We're very fortunate to have Barney Graham to give us a keynote lecture on this topic. We also heard the welcoming remarks yesterday from Dr. Lasison that highlights this important issue. And so this program is really quite diverse and broad, with a major focus on immunology, but also touching on some of these other crucially important issues. And finally, you might be wondering, why Atlanta? As I said, it's not simply because I spent 15 years here at Emory, but also because Atlanta is such a vibrant hub for vaccine biology, vaccine medicine, infectious disease research, and it represents many great institutions such as Morehouse, UGA, Georgia State, Georgia Tech, and of course Emory that serve the underrepresented minority communities. And so we're absolutely thrilled to be able to attract such young talent from the underrepresented minority population to come, to share their ideas, and to learn collectively. So without further ado, as I said, we're so fortunate and privileged that Barney kindly accepted our invitation to deliver the keynote talk, and I'd like to invite Bob Cedar to come and introduce Barney Graham. Bob.
So thanks, Bali, for introducing the focus of the meeting and the excitement to be here. It's really a great honor to introduce my colleague Barney Graham. I can tell you just Barney's beginnings began on a farm in Kansas. And from that farm, Barney went to Rice University and then came back to Kansas for medical school, where he was at the top of his class. And then he began his journey into virology. He went to Vanderbilt, and he did his residency in internal medicine, infectious disease at Vanderbilt, got a PhD in Vanderbilt. And really, that was the formative part of his scientific career that really ignited his love of viruses, and particularly RSV. And so in 2000, he left Vanderbilt, and this was 2000 was the initiation of the Vaccine Research Center at the National Institute of Health. And a group of us were put together at that time. Barney was recruited for two reasons. One is his great expertise in RSV, and he had his own laboratory. And then Barney was a master clinician. So over probably 10 or 15 years, Barney also was noted around the world as being a great clinical trialist. He's what they call a triple threat. And so Barney came in to start our clinic at the Vaccine Research Center. And And over the next 20 years, something incredible happened. Barney was doing his lab work. He was running the clinical trials. And on the fourth floor of the vaccine center, Peter Kwong had a structural-based biology section, which was really, we thought, critical for vaccines. But there wasn't enough space for Jason McClellan, and he was on the second floor. So Barney would go out and have lunch and be talking to Jason about his work in RSV. And that's when he ignited a relationship with Jason about why RSV was an important target. And Jason began to work on RSV with Barney. And what they ended up doing was solving the long elusive pre-fusion structure. And based on that, they were able to make the RSV vaccine, which I think was approved a month ago. That paradigm caused Barney then to really understand the importance of structure across other viruses. And of course, that led into his interest in coronaviruses. And I can tell you, Barney was studying coronaviruses along with probably Ralph Barrick and maybe Stanley Perlman. There weren't many people, really, a lot of people studying coronaviruses, but he was prepared, and he was studying MERS and SARS, and he had a wonderful fellow, Kazmikia Corbett, who was working on it. And of course, when SARS-CoV-2 came, he was ready. And basically the story was him and Jason had a paradigm of a vaccine from SARS and MERS. And I remember sitting there on January 10th, we were in a conference room, he just needed the Wuhan sequence. On January 13th, he sent the design to Moderna to make the SARS-CoV-2, which was the S2P, which was used in all other vaccines essentially. So that is kind of a story, I think, of collaboration and how you have critical mass of people, and then using his skills not only as a basic virologist and an immunologist, but also as a clinician to run the whole gamut. Since then, Barney, as a lot of us, I think, felt it was time to do something else. And so he came down here and he became, his current position is Professor of Medicine, Microbiology, Biochemistry, and Immunology at Morehouse and Senior Advisor for Global Health Equity. And I will tell you that recently, and I think he'll talk about this today, they've now established a Satcher Institute to tackle global health inequities. Along the way, Barney, you can understand, has collected a few awards. Of course, membership in the National Academy of Sciences, Time Magazine naming him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So I'm going to let Barney come up here. I can just say from a personal perspective that there is no finer individual in the world than Barney Graham that I know.
All right. Well, it's my privilege and honor to be here. I thank you all for the invitation. And Bob reminded me of the song, Killing Me Softly with his song, telling my whole life with his words. So anyway, after all that, let's talk about vaccines. And I'm going to start by really reviewing and telling you things you already know to try to set the stage for what we want to talk about at the end. So first, I'm an inventor on vaccines and monoclonal antibodies for several virus diseases and on advisory boards now and consulting for several pharmaceutical companies. First, I just want to state it that vaccines work. And this is a track record of vaccine efficacy for several virus diseases. And we know that vaccines work. Sometimes they even work before you've vaccinated everyone. They start working even before, as is in the case with mumps. I don't know if Walter Ornstein is here, but I put this in for him. And you start vaccinating the population and diseases start going away even before you've vaccinated most of the people. We also know vaccines save lives. And this study showed that an estimated 50 million lives have been saved just between 2000 and 2019. And 2.7 billion life years have been saved from vaccines, estimated in this study. WHO often uses the number that maybe 3 to 4 million lives are saved each year. But we make vaccines not just to save lives, but to improve lives. We also know that many of our vaccines that are effective and have been put to good use in high-income countries have a delay in getting to low and middle-income countries. This is just an example from one of Dr. Plotkin's reviews on 3 vaccines. The solid lines are high income, dashed lines are middle income, and dotted lines are low income. And you can see that there's sometimes decades between getting started in a low income country, even getting to the point where the high income country started. There's been a lot of efforts over the years to have global initiatives to address these problems, starting 50 years ago with the expanded program on immunization. There was Gavi was set up in the year 2000. We started the Decade of Vaccines in 2010, and the Global Vaccine Action Plan was endorsed by virtually every country on Earth, intending to really prepare us for the future. Part of that vaccine action plan was not just to make new and better vaccines, but to have policies in place in all those countries ahead of time. CEPI was created in 2017, now focused on pandemic preparedness, and it was a big part of the response to COVID. And now we have a new immunization agenda 2030 that hopes to really achieve some of the goals that were set in the first decade of vaccines. We're still working toward that. So there have been efforts to make things better over time. And we have had some spectacular successes with vaccines. The eradication of smallpox was a monumental achievement, and there was something that led the world, including high-income countries, to help make this go away, which required a lot of work in low-income countries. Somehow we have to recapture that spirit that led to this being a global effort to address diseases across the economic spectrum. And you see some of the people, we're in Atlanta, so I should mention Bill Foege here. And we're showing here the last man on Earth who had variola minor, and the last baby on Earth who had variola major. And Joel Bremen is standing here with that woman after her child survived in that crisis. So the world can come together. High-income countries can facilitate a global response to diseases that exist primarily at that time in low-income countries. So the question is, how do we do that more often? We're also now, I think, have achieved a great technological success and have, I think, entered this new era where we can do atomic level structure design of vaccines. We have all these other amazing technologies. We can deliver protein-based vaccines used by gene-based delivery. We can do high-throughput sequencing, rapidly identify new pandemic threats. We can rapidly synthesize new biologics by making nucleic acids. We can understand B-cell responses at the single-cell level. design custom nanoparticles to display whatever antigen in whatever geometric pattern you think is going to be best. It's an amazing time to be a young researcher. So if you have 30 years ahead of you and want to make a vaccine, this is a great time to be doing that. I couldn't have even imagined some of these technologies and some of the depth of understanding you can have now in biology that can guide your vaccine development. But I think at this point, we have to try to add health justice and equity and global cooperation and coordination if we're really going to make additional new advances using all these technologies. My favorite example of this technology, and Bob introduced you to this, is the work on RSV. RSV was discovered in 1956 and associated with bronchiolitis, and over time was understood to not only cause severe disease in babies, but in the elderly. And efforts to make a vaccine early on when Jonas Salk and others had such success with the polio vaccine by just simply making a whole inactivated virus and using that for the vaccine. When that was done with RSV, it caused a vaccine-enhanced disease. And it took a couple of decades to get vaccine development back on track. And it took a detailed understanding of some of the immunological problems that led to that vaccine-enhanced disease. But over time, and with the new technologies that were really fostered through attempts to make an HIV vaccine, we got to a place where we could capture the prefusion structure of the RSV F glycoprotein, which is the main target. And the important thing about that, beyond just knowing what it looked like and knowing how it worked and mapping antigenic sites, is that these sites at the apex of the prefusion, the orange and red sites, those surfaces disappear on the rearranged molecule, which had been used in 5 efficacy trials and always coming up with the same conclusion that you boost neutralizing activity a couple-fold and don't really achieve your efficacy endpoints. But if you can stabilize this and maintain those antigenic sites that we can now see and define at the atomic level, all of a sudden you have a vaccine candidate. And over those 10 years, from 2012 and 13 to now, all of these new products have finally reached a conclusion. There's been a dramatic set of studies that have been done by these groups over the last few years, reaching very positive conclusions. And now we have vaccines approved for the elderly and for maternal immunization, and even a very potent long-acting antibody that can be given directly to babies, all of which should be available for this next winter season. Some of that technology was applied in coronavirus vaccine development based on several years of trying to understand the spike glycoprotein, and informed by all the work on RSV and thinking about how to do pandemic preparedness and platform manufacturing and rapid response to these other pandemics. And as you know, there was a rapid timeline. We were able to, instead of 10 years like RSV, get to efficacy trials within 6 months and authorization within about 11 months. And the whole world was involved. The WHO landscape analysis tells us that as many as 350 different vaccine development programs existed around the world. More than 150 of those got into clinical trials, and using virtually every vaccine modality you can imagine. And as Bali said, it's created this incredible database that will probably be mined for the next few decades on using virtually identical antigens by multiple different modalities in multiple populations, both antigen naive and antigen experienced, and created this wealth of immunology that should help us going forward with other diseases. And it saved a lot of lives. Some estimates in the US were that by the end of 2022, maybe 3 million deaths were averted, and Imperial College estimated maybe in 2021 that upwards of 19 million deaths were averted based on excess mortality. And if you look at excess mortality around the world, you see in this upper left quadrant that in high-income countries, the excess mortality measured in 2020 and 2021 tracked almost exactly with coronavirus documented deaths. Less so with middle income, even less so with low income, low and middle and low income. But if you just look at excess deaths, which was probably a measure of coronavirus mortality, you see that most of it, the largest share, was in low and middle income countries and low income countries. And you see that represented here in a different type of graph. So in terms of excess mortality, you may have had around 15 million deaths in 2020 and 2021, most of which were in low-income countries. And then if you model deaths averted using the excess mortality as a guide from this graph and just look at the deaths averted in high and low and middle-income countries, you see most of the averted deaths were in high-income countries, and less so as you go down. And you really can barely see that little orange strip at the bottom. Those are the deaths averted in low-income countries. So it's pretty obvious that coronavirus pandemic not just reveals some of the scientific capabilities we have, but also some of the equity deficiencies we have. Most of this was related to how rapidly vaccine programs were implemented in these countries. So this is just a representation of high income to low, middle to low income country implementation in terms of percent of population by around middle of 2021. And I think if you didn't start vaccinating by June of 2021, you didn't get to have a big impact on your overall pandemic mortality. So addressing the pandemic and really using vaccines to their best effectiveness requires a quick start. And I've said this many times, but I think if we can't learn how to immunize the whole world in 6 months, we're going to be burdened with repeating this over and over. If it takes us 6 years or 10 years to immunize everyone on Earth, it's what drives the antigenic variation. It drives all of the things that we've seen, largely, I think, because of inequitable vaccine delivery. So I wrote this article for the New York Times on the third anniversary of the pandemic being declared in March 11th of 2020. And this is the title they gave it. The title I really wanted was, We Have Cutting Edge Science, but Can Policy and Practice Keep Up? And so can we sociologically and economically keep up with what our capabilities are in science? And I think this image, this graphic, this map tells a big story. And there's two major points I want to make here. One is that this is a map from relatively recently. This is from March. It looks about the same now, but what you see is there is a large Africa, the continent of Africa, and other low and middle income countries scattered throughout was still largely unimmunized by March of 2023. And by the end of 2021, less than 5% of Africans were immunized. And that is the thing that I think needs to be addressed, because it reflects a lack of access to vaccines and a lack of access to deliverable health care. The other thing I want to point out is this color of the United States, which is, around the 70% mark. So in a country where there is full access to the vaccine, full access to the help you can get, the immunity you can get ahead of time to prevent death and catastrophe, there was about 30% of Americans who decided they didn't want to take the vaccine. So I think this represents a failure on multiple different levels. In my opinion, it represents a moral failure. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I think that is the basis of it. It also represents a failure of education and communication, which I think explains what happened in the United States. It represents a failure of policy and practice and planning that explains what happened in the African continent. And it really represents a failure not of science, but of scientific engineering and capacity. Science, engineering, capacity. And I'll try to explain that as we go. So to me, this map says a lot of things, and you might go back to Marvin Gaye and just say, what's going on? Why does it still have to be like this? We learned during smallpox eradication that when high-income countries invest in things that have global consequences, we can have a good outcome. So the Global Vaccine Action Plan, one of its major goals in 2010 was to establish vaccine policies in countries, in those 194 countries around the world that agreed. And so when vaccines first became available, this is the day I got my first vaccine, December 24th, 2020. This was almost 9 months into the pandemic. These were the countries who had any vaccine policy written down on what to do if we did get a vaccine. Very few of those 194 countries had any kind of plan, even though this was 9 months, almost a year into the pandemic. And even by the middle of 2021, most places had something written down on paper now, but it was really too late, I believe, at that time to have the biggest impact on vaccines curtailing or modifying the overall pandemic. And you see in Africa, the policies were in place at that time, and yet 6 months later, there was still less than 5% of that continent vaccinated. So I think there was a failure of policy, but even when policies were in place, there was a failure to deliver vaccines globally. Some of this, I think, can be related to just where are the capacities for manufacturing. And this is just a graph from around the middle of 2021 on how many doses had been administered on this side and where vaccines had been manufactured on this side. And you see that they pretty much line up. You're either manufacturing vaccines or you're a high-income country. And so one of the premises that I would like to leave you with is that until we have scientific capacity and manufacturing capacity everywhere, we're going to keep facing these kind of inequities in all of our future pandemics. So usually I'm giving talks about viruses and lymphocytes, and I want to at least say one thing about what I think are still some scientific challenges. We have a lot of great scientific technologies, but there are still some pathogens for which we cannot design an effective vaccine. And I think this is my list. This is my top list of things that I think need to be understood by some of the young people in the room who have 30 years to figure it out. And the technologies we have now, especially single-cell B-cell analysis, really understanding the repertoire of B cells that respond to each subsequent antigenic stimulus, I think that kind of technology can start helping us understand how to achieve breadth against pathogens with antigenic variation and try to solve this problem of immunodominance and maintenance of the right memory B and T cell phenotypes and immunity in the right place. And then we have to keep working on engineering solutions for designing both antigens and delivery approaches for stability, cost, and effectiveness. But I want to talk a little bit about just this other work in addition to all the things that are great out there. How do we work toward health justice, including vaccine equity? And how do we solve regional problems before they become global problems by facilitating research and manufacturing in low and middle income countries? And God help us if we can't figure this out for vaccines, which are so obvious. We know how to make vaccines. We know that they work. We know that they save lives. They're probably one of the easiest, cheapest biomedical interventions you can do to improve health. And if we can't figure this out for vaccines, how do we ever figure it out for maternal health or mental health or all the other aspects of health that are still problems ahead of us? And if we can't figure it out for vaccines, how do we keep the young people healthy and active so that the young person in Zimbabwe or North Dakota or wherever they end up being born has a chance to grow up and have that insight that we need for the next problem? I think we really need to be able to access all the talent on earth if we're going to solve the problems that are ahead of us. And each child that is lost or left behind diminishes our chances, I think, of getting to a better place. So at Morehouse School of Medicine, where I am now a faculty member since I left my friends at the VRC, we've just launched a new Global Health Equity Institute, the David Satcher Global Health Equity Institute. You might know David Satcher. He was the only person who's ever been a U.S. Surgeon General and the head of the CDC and the president of a couple of medical colleges, and has devoted his whole life to health equity. So the major goal of this new institute is to diversify the scientific and public health workforce. We want to do that through education and increasing student participation in global health so that they have options and opportunities and experience and can see what's possible going forward. We want to facilitate scientific advances in low-resource settings. And we want to develop an Office of Global Policy and Government Relations. So I won't go through all the details of how we hope to do that, but mostly it involves fundraising. And I think that the thing that makes Morehouse School of Medicine different and maybe able to address some of these problems in ways that other places can't is that at Morehouse School of Medicine, our students are the primary answer. They're the primary asset. They're the way that these problems are going to be solved in the future. Morehouse takes a more community-oriented approach to improving health and not such an individualized approach to that. And it is experienced in working effectively in under-resourced settings. In fact, I consider Morehouse School of Medicine, which is an HBCU medical school, a low-resource institution in a high-income country. It's dedicated to equal partnership and to cultural humility and discerning misinformation and misdirection, which is really the basis for a lot of the inequities that happen and a lot of the bad decision-making that people make about taking vaccines or about maintaining inequity. Discerning misinformation and misdirection is a part of everyday life for people at Morehouse School of Medicine. So I'm going to stop here. I can take a few questions. The take-home message is that science is advancing at an exponential pace, but there's been a failure to understand how achieving educational and technological and health equity has mutual benefit for high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries. And until high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries work together, there's work to do on both sides, and largely at a government level. The governments of high-income countries need to make choices of what is going to be in their best interest over time, and the low-income countries need to match some of that investment in basic research and human capital that will be needed to generate the facilities and research facilities that lead to manufacturing facilities to get to this new and better place. So I will stop there. Questions or go to break?
Barney, Jay Coles at Tulane. So we're developing a going MD PhD program with Xavier University in New Orleans to address some of the issues you addressed. And one of the concerns that's come up is the recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. And as you know, that was targeted to undergraduate education. And there's ample evidence that for medical education, that having diversity of practitioners in the community it has clear evidence of health care benefit. So do you think that, what's Morehouse's position on this recent Supreme Court decision, and do you foresee potentially having to litigate this to get equity that we need?
Well, I don't want to be glib about it, but this will probably help Morehouse because we'll get better students, more students that would have otherwise been able to go to a lot of other places. But the problem at Morehouse is we already have 8,000 applications for 110 positions in first-year medical school. So we already have too much competition for the few slots that are available. And in this country, even in local regional care, fewer than 5% of physicians are Black for a population that's 13% or more Black. And so the reason we think that diversifying the public health and global and scientific workforce will solve the equity problems is because as that workforce develops more leadership positions, they will make different and I think better decisions and be able to engage communities more effectively because they're part of those communities. And I think to the extent that we can diversify, not just along racial, ethnic bounds, but economic and all sorts of other parameters. And the more we can diversify the public health and scientific workforce, I think the better we will do. Equity is not just the trickle-down effects of who gets what product at what time. It is who actually gets to decide what products to make and who gets to do the work to make the products and who gets to be trained to figure out how to do the work to make those products. So I think the equity thing has to go all the way down to very low levels. And the affirmative action judgment by the court is going to hurt the world and hurt the country And I think it makes HBCU medical schools even more important because we need more diverse workforce, not just in public health, but in primary care. That's the reason Morehouse was established, is to diversify the primary care workforce, and they've done that, especially in Georgia, taking the ratio from 1 black physician to 14,000 black patients down to about 1 in 3,000. So Morehouse has accomplished that local mission in primary care, and the question is, what can we do to try to change the formula around the world?
Thank you very much, Barney, for that wonderful presentation. I have a question and then a comment. My question is this. You showed us a very interesting map of the globe with access to vaccines and the proportion of the population that had received vaccines. And it was striking that in the richest country in the world, the United States of America, despite the abundance of vaccine, only 70% of the population have received vaccines. And chiefly this is caused by vaccine hesitancy. To what extent do you think vaccine hesitancy represents an essential component of looking at global equity? And are you addressing this issue in your institute? Are you planning to?
Well, I think misinformation and misdirection, disinformation, is at the root of inequity of all sorts. I mean, that is how that is how it's maintained. Those kind of strategies have been going on since the beginning of time. And for vaccine inequity, whether it's access for economic reasons or uptake for political reasons, misinformation and misdirection is at the root of a lot of these problems. And so, again, I'm looking around at the 30-year-olds or hopefully 25-year-olds in the room who can help figure out ways of improving or battling or countering the misinformation that is now in media platforms that I barely understand. So, I do not understand them. I don't know how to counter them, but there's a lot of young people here, including my 8-year-old granddaughter, Anaya. She gets it more intuitively than I do.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that the young people, if we can open doors and not put too many barriers in their way, they can figure some of this out.
Yeah. The quick comment is that you referred to this in your remarks, that is, addressing this issue of vaccine equity, positioned as it is at the focal point of geopolitics, economics, and so on, is really, I think, a stepping stone to addressing global equity in many other areas, climate change and so on and so forth. So I think this could be catalytic in how it transforms equity issues throughout the world.
We hope so.
Well, thank you, Barney. And really congratulations on taking this equity and education on board, because I think this is essential. Now, and I think the hesitancy and the fact that we don't deliver the vaccines the right way is because there is not really education about it. So the problem with it, and I think your approach at Morehouse School is excellent, because we need to educate. Now the question is, educating people at 25 and beyond is very difficult because they're grown up. They already have their own ideas. Very difficult to change the ideas. So I think if we really want to educate the world about vaccines, about the importance of vaccines for and the effect they have, we need to go down to the children. And somehow we should discuss how we can do that. Because if we don't educate, the children can educate the parents. If they go back from school, they say, I need to be vaccinated. It will be very difficult for the parents to say no. So I don't know, my opinion is that we should really go down and push the education very early on in life so that people grow up knowing what is the impact of vaccination on, just life expectancy. We've gone from 30 years to 40 years to 80 years in most of the countries. And life expectancy is going up everywhere, low and high income countries, thanks to vaccination. And so we need to tell the story. It's a huge, beautiful story that nobody tells to the children. And then we complain that when they get 25, they become parents, they don't understand. It's too late.
Totally agree, and that's one of the reasons why for this new institute, we're trying to raise the money for endowments, because this is a multi-decade process.
Absolutely.
It really it requires generational change.
But also requires, more institutions, more people basically to lead this effort.
I agree. And Morehouse School of Medicine has adopted a primary elementary school, the Tuskegee Air Academy, and it's about 600 children who come to Morehouse School of Medicine campus every year. They're mentored by faculty members. And if every medical institution in the country or the world was doing that, we would start penetrating and improving some of the biology education. For some reason, if young people thought about biology the way I do, I think 90% of them would want to be biologists. And somehow they're just not choosing that often enough. And so I think we need to improve and help them understand the excitement about biology. And over time, I'm hoping with new tools that are used for good instead of for bad, that we can replace these generations with more knowledgeable young people. I totally agree. And the other problem is that, at least at Morehouse, I think the average debt that medical students leave with is between $250,000 and $300,000. You cannot make a choice to be a public health official or a scientist if you've got that much debt, and probably several other families to take care of. So until we can reduce tuition debt, it's the other reason for raising money and endowing things that can be perpetuated. Till we get rid of that debt, many of the students who would be inclined to do public health will not be able to choose that. So totally agree with starting with the children, but we also have to remove the barriers that make it hard for people to choose the fields that we need to change. Okay, well, thank you all.